Thanksgiving has a way of making everyone pretend. The golden light of candles and the scent of roasted turkey filled my parents' dining room, but underneath, the warmth was a tension I could taste sharper than cranberry sauce. The long table was dressed in its annual disguise: linen tablecloth, polished silverware, wine glasses set like ornaments. My family had mastered the art of appearances, and tonight they were ready to put on a show. I took my usual seat at the far end, where the light from the chandelier dimmed and shadows clung to the corners. My brother Daniel sat at the center, basking in attention like it was his birthright. He wore a suit that looked tailored, navy blue with a tie that screamed success. He didn't need the spotlight. It followed him naturally, or maybe my parents angled it toward him. Conversation bubbled around the table, laughter spilling over like gravy. Uncle Rob told the same old story about how he once outran a bear in the Smoky Mountains, and everyone chuckled politely. My aunt gushed about her new kitchen renovation, passing her phone around to show pictures. My brother leaned back in his chair, sipping wine like a king, nodding along as though everyone's joy somehow revolved around him. I tried to sink into the background. It wasn't that I hated family gatherings. I hated how small I felt at them. I had lost my job a few months earlier, the layoff wrapped up in cheerful corporate phrases like restructuring and position redundancy. To my family, it meant one thing: failure. I knew the whispers. I had overheard them when I passed through the kitchen earlier. My cousin had asked my mother, "Is she still out of work?" My mother sighed in that disappointed tone she had perfected and said, "Yes, we're hoping she figures things out soon." As though I were a teenager refusing to do homework, not a grown woman blindsided by a collapsing company. I told myself to breathe, to endure the evening. I cut small bites of turkey, nodded politely at the stories, and pretended not to notice the glances sliding down the table toward me. Then it happened. The moment that would brand itself into my memory like a scar. Dessert had just been served. Pecan pie, warm with whipped cream, and Daniel leaned forward, wine glass in hand. His voice rose above the chatter, sharp and smooth, crafted to command attention. "At least I have a job," he said with a smirk, "unlike my unemployed sister." The words cut through the room. The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was enough. A couple of cousins chuckled, others looked away uncomfortably, and my parents shifted in their seats, not to stop him, but to let the moment pass without confrontation. My cheeks burned hotter than the sweet potatoes on the table. I forced a laugh, brittle and thin. "That's not fair, Daniel. You know I've been applying and the market's been brutal." He raised his brows, taking another sip of wine. "Excuses, excuses. Some of us know how to keep a paycheck coming. Maybe you should take notes." The laughter grew, spilling across the table like a stain. My uncle snorted into his napkin. My aunt smirked into her glass. Even the cousins who looked guilty didn't speak up for me. Their silence weighed more than their laughter. I tried again, voice trembling but determined. "I've been working hard behind the scenes. Just because you don't see it doesn't mean I'm not doing anything." "Behind the scenes," he mocked. "Is that what you call binge-watching shows in your apartment? Sounds productive." This time, the laughter was louder. I swallowed hard, blinking back the sting in my eyes. I wanted to scream, to list every resume I had sent, every rejection email I had endured, every sleepless night spent wondering if I was worth anything at all. But what good would it do? No one wanted to hear my fight. They wanted to laugh at my failure. I looked at my parents, hoping for rescue. My mother avoided my eyes, busying herself with slicing pie. My father cleared his throat, muttering something about kids these days needing to toughen up. Not once did he tell Daniel to stop. Not once did he defend me. That was the cruelest cut of all. I sat there, the clink of silverware and the hum of conversation resuming around me as though nothing had happened. To them, it was a joke, a passing jab in a family gathering. To me, it was confirmation in their eyes I was a failure, a punchline at my own table. I forced myself to eat, chewing pie that tasted like ashes. My hands trembled, but I folded them neatly in my lap, masking the storm inside me. I smiled when spoken to, laughed when expected, played the role of the quiet sister who didn't know her place. But inside, something shifted. It was a vow, silent but sharp, forged in the fire of humiliation. Daniel thought he had won, that his words had buried me under shame. My family thought I would remain the shadow at the table, silent and small. They were wrong. I sat in that golden light, letting their laughter wash over me, and in the quiet corners of my heart, I promised myself one thing: this would not be the end of my story. I would rise. I would fight. And one day they would choke on their laughter. People think humiliation happens in a single moment. They don't see how it grows like a shadow, stretching back years, taking root in every small dismissal and forgotten glance. That Thanksgiving wasn't the first time my brother mocked me. It was simply the loudest echo of a rivalry that had been planted in our childhood. From the very beginning, Daniel was the golden child. I still remember how my father's eyes lit up whenever Daniel did something that could be twisted into a sign of greatness. He was 6 when he sold lemonade on the corner one summer, and my father declared he had a natural head for business. The truth was that my mother baked the cookies, my aunt brought the pitcher of lemonade, and Daniel just stood there grinning while the neighbors bought out of pity. Still, my father clapped him on the back, saying, "This boy is going places." When I painted my first picture in art class, a messy swirl of colors my teacher said showed promise, I ran home beaming. My father glanced at it once and said, "That's nice, sweetheart, but you should focus on things that matter. Like numbers, like business." He slid my painting onto the kitchen counter where coffee stains bled into the paper. At family gatherings, Daniel's achievements became the centerpieces of conversation. Daniel won first place in the science fair. Daniel got into honors math. Daniel landed an internship before senior year. Each announcement was followed by applause, as though he were the lead actor on stage. When my turn came, my accomplishments were brushed aside with polite nods. I could recite an entire poem from memory, earn on a history project, even help organize a fundraiser, and it would vanish into silence. I learned early how invisible a girl can feel in her own home. My mother tried sometimes. She would pat my hand and whisper, "I'm proud of you," but never loudly enough for anyone else to hear. My father's pride was reserved, his voice booming only when it was for Daniel. And Daniel, he grew fat on that pride. It was his currency, his crown. As we got older, the gap widened. I remember one Christmas when I was 13. I had saved up babysitting money to buy my father a leather wallet, something simple but heartfelt. Daniel bought him a tie with my mother's money. When my father opened the gifts, he laughed and said, "This tie is sharp, just like you, son." He wore it proudly to work the next week. The wallet stayed in its box on the shelf, untouched. That was the rhythm of our lives. Daniel's smallest effort became a victory. My greatest effort became background noise. And he knew it. By the time he reached high school, Daniel carried himself like royalty. He lorded over me not just as a brother, but as someone convinced of his own superiority. When I got a part in the school play, he sneered, "That's not a real achievement. You're just pretending on stage." When I made honor roll, he shrugged and said, "Grades don't matter unless you know how to use them. That's why Dad cares more about me." It hurt. Of course it did. But something else grew inside me too, resilience. When you're constantly overlooked, you learn how to keep going without applause. You learn to fuel yourself with silence, to sharpen your edges in private. While Daniel basked in praise, I built myself quietly. I stayed up late reading, taught myself new skills, explored hobbies he mocked because they weren't useful. If no one was going to hand me the spotlight, I would learn how to stand steady in the dark. I didn't realize it at the time, but those years forged a strength my brother never had. He needed validation like air. I learned to live without it. He needed to be seen. I learned how to act unseen. One memory still sits with me. I was 16, sitting at the dining room table, working through a book on coding I had borrowed from the library. Daniel walked in with my father, bragging about some business idea he had for a car washing service. My father beamed, listening intently, then turned to me and asked, "Why are you wasting your time with that? Do you even understand what you're reading?" I looked him in the eye and said, "Yes, I do." He laughed, shaking his head. "Don't get lost in your little hobbies. Focus on something practical." That word, practical, became a knife. Practical meant what Daniel wanted. Practical meant what my father understood. My dreams, my curiosity, my passions, they were dismissed as impractical. But that night, when the house was quiet, I stayed up until 2 in the morning finishing the chapter. Because even if no one believed in me, I believed in myself. The years passed, and Daniel grew more entitled. In college, he chose business administration, naturally. Every holiday, he came home with stories of networking events, professors who praised him, internships he lined up through my father's connections. At the same time, when I chose literature as my major, my father sighed like I had sentenced myself to poverty. Daniel smirked, telling me I would probably end up teaching or unemployed. His words stung, but they also lit a fire. If my brother's life was built on constant validation, mine was built on defiance. Every time he told me I couldn't, I found a way to prove, at least to myself, that I could. The problem was, no one else saw it. The narrative had been written long before Daniel, the achiever, me, the disappointment. Every Thanksgiving, Christmas, birthday, it played out the same way. Daniel at the center, me at the edges. So when he made that remark at Thanksgiving, "At least I have a job, unlike my unemployed sister," it wasn't just a single insult. It was the culmination of years. Every dismissal, every smirk, every moment when my father's hand landed on his shoulder but never on mine. I sat there in that golden glow, surrounded by laughter, and realized this wasn't new. It was only louder. Daniel had always been the voice that drowned me out. My family had always been the audience that clapped for him and turned away from me. The humiliation at the table was not born that night. It was the final chord of a song that had been playing since childhood. But here's the thing, songs end. And when they do, silence has its own power. While my brother basked in his arrogance, I carried something deeper. Patience, strategy, a kind of strength you can only learn when no one expects anything from you. He believed he had crushed me with his words, but he had only reminded me of what I already knew. He underestimated me. And people who underestimate you never see you coming. That was the story of our rivalry. Not two equals battling for recognition, but a brother raised on applause and a sister raised on rejection. He thought rejection would break me. What he didn't know was that rejection had built me. By the time Thanksgiving rolled around, I wasn't the weak girl at the edge of the table anymore. I was someone else entirely, someone he would regret overlooking. Losing my job didn't happen with fireworks or drama. It came in an email. One line at the top read, "Due to restructuring, your position has been eliminated." Just like that, years of effort dissolved into a few corporate phrases. I sat frozen at my desk, staring at the words, unable to process them. Around me, coworkers shuffled back to their cubicles carrying boxes of their belongings. Some cried, some cursed. I just sat still, like if I didn't move, maybe it wouldn't be real, but it was real. My keycard stopped working that very afternoon. My laptop was taken. I walked out carrying my things in a cardboard box, my reflection in the glass doors warped and unfamiliar. It felt less like losing a job and more like losing an identity. At first, I thought I could bounce back. I polished my resume, sent out applications, scheduled phone interviews. Every morning, I woke early and dressed as if I were going into the office, sitting at my dining table with my laptop open. I refused to let myself fall apart. But weeks turned into months and the rejection emails stacked up like tombstones. We regret to inform you. We've decided to move forward with another candidate. Thank you for your time. Each one chipped away at me. Bills piled up. I stopped going out with friends because I couldn't afford even a coffee. I learned how to stretch a bag of rice across a week's meals. Nights were the worst, when the silence pressed in and the doubts grew louder. I told myself I was strong, but sometimes strength felt like nothing more than surviving another day, and the gossip didn't help. My family never wasted an opportunity to remind me of my failure. My aunt would tilt her head sympathetically and say, "Still no luck. Well, maybe you should think about going back to school for something more useful." My cousin, fresh out of college, boasted about her new job, throwing side glances my way as if to say, "See. It's not that hard." Even my mother, who tried to soften the blows, couldn't help herself. "Don't take it personally, honey," she whispered once. "Not everyone's cut out for big success." Every comment was disguised as concern, but I felt the sting beneath the sugar. I became the family's cautionary tale, the sister who had stumbled, the daughter who hadn't measured up. And then there was Daniel. He never missed a chance to flaunt his success. He would arrive at family dinners in a new car, keys dangling from his hand like jewelry. He talked about his company, with the pride of a king recounting his conquests. "We just landed a new contract," he'd announce, puffing out his chest. "Profits are up this quarter. Employees are lucky to work for me." Everyone clapped, nodded, congratulated him. I sat in silence, shrinking in my chair, wondering how it felt to be the person the whole family admired. Daniel loved to rub salt in the wound. "Maybe I should give you a job at my company," he said one evening, smirking. "Though I'm not sure where you'd fit, maybe front desk, something simple." His words sliced through me, but I forced a tight smile, because showing hurt only gave him power. What no one saw was how hard I was working behind the scenes. Every morning I studied. I took free online courses, earning certificates in finance, management, and strategy. I networked on professional sites, sending messages to strangers, asking for advice, connections, anything. I went to library workshops, met mentors, absorbed everything I could. I was building myself brick by brick, silently, carefully. My family didn't notice. To them, I was still the girl on the couch, unemployed, wasting time. But I knew better. I was preparing, even if I didn't yet know for what. It was during one of my late-night research sessions that I stumbled across something curious. I had been reading through market reports, partly out of habit, partly to distract myself from the gnawing fear of failure. Daniel's company name popped up in a small side article. At first, I thought it was just another piece praising their growth. But when I read closer, I saw words like rising debt, internal disputes, and high turnover. My heart skipped. I dug deeper. I searched through financial filings, employee reviews, industry whispers on forums. What I found made my pulse quicken. The cracks were there, subtle but spreading. His company wasn't as invincible as he pretended. Contracts were falling through. Investors were getting nervous. Employees were leaving faster than he could replace them. And Daniel, he was too busy boasting at family dinners to see it. That night, sitting alone at my kitchen table with the glow of my laptop painting the room in blue light, I felt something shift inside me. For the first time in months, the weight on my chest lifted. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't broken. I whispered it to myself like a prayer, like a vow. He thinks I'm unemployed. He thinks I'm nothing. But he doesn't know his empire is crumbling, and I'm going to be the one to take it from him. The scars of rejection had hardened me. The struggle had sharpened me. And now, staring at the cracks in Daniel's empire, I knew my chance had finally come. The night I discovered those first whispers about Daniel's company, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake with my laptop glowing beside me, scrolling through filings and articles until the numbers blurred. Every line of debt, every negative review, every cautious word from an analyst, it all formed a picture I had never imagined. My brother, the golden child, was not untouchable. The next morning, I brewed coffee I could barely afford and sat down to dig deeper. I combed through financial statements, learning to read between the lines. Expenses were rising faster than revenue. Debt was piling up under the surface, hidden by flashy quarterly reports. A few contracts had been delayed or canceled, leaving holes that no one outside the company had noticed yet. Then I found the employee forums. Former staff wrote about long hours, broken promises, a culture of arrogance trickling down from the top. One review stood out. The CEO is too busy proving he's right to notice he's driving us off a cliff. That CEO was my brother. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sorrow. On one hand, Daniel deserved this collapse. He had built his identity on dominance, on belittling others, including me. But on the other hand, part of me wished he'd been better. Wished he'd been the leader he bragged about being. Wished I could admire him without the sting of bitterness. But wishing wouldn't change the truth. His empire was cracking, and the cracks were widening. I knew I couldn't take this on alone. That's when I thought of Mrs. Patel, a retired financial consultant I had met at a library workshop months earlier. She had been one of the few people who looked me in the eye when I asked questions, who treated me not as a lost cause but as someone capable. I reached out nervously, half expecting her to ignore me. To my surprise, she replied within the hour. "Come by tomorrow," her message read. "Bring what you've found." Her office was nothing grand, just a room above a small bookstore, but when I laid out the printouts and spreadsheets, she studied them with the sharp eyes of someone who had seen empires rise and fall. "You're right," she said finally, tapping the paper with her pen. "This company is leaking at the seams, but your brother is clever enough to disguise it. Most people won't notice until it's too late." "Do you think it can be saved?" I asked. She leaned back in her chair, considering me. "With the right leadership, maybe. But the question is, why are you so interested?" I hesitated. Then the words tumbled out. The humiliation, the years of being overlooked, the way Daniel had used his success as a weapon against me. I told her how I wanted, not just to see him fall, but to build something better in the ruins he had created. Mrs. Patel listened silently, then smiled, a small but knowing smile. "You're not driven by greed, you're driven by justice. That's rarer than you think. If you're serious, I'll help you." For the first time in months, maybe years, someone believed in me, but Daniel had no idea. To him, I was still the sister who couldn't get her life together. He reminded me of it constantly. One evening, he invited me for coffee under the pretense of catching up. I should have known better, but I went anyway. We sat in a glossy cafe, him in another expensive suit, me clutching a mug I couldn't afford without wincing. "So," he said casually, stirring his drink, "any luck with the whole job thing?" "I'm working on it," I replied evenly. He smirked. Working on it. That's what people say when they're failing, you know. Meanwhile, I'm negotiating a deal that could double our revenue. Some people rise, some people sink. Guess which one you are. His words were meant to sting, and they did. But behind my calm face, I held onto a secret. I knew his deal was falling apart. I knew his empire wasn't nearly as stable as he believed. And one day, I would be the one across the table, watching him sink. I left the cafe with my jaw tight and my chest burning. His arrogance wasn't just personal, it was dangerous. It blinded him to the damage he was causing, to the people working under him, to the future of the company itself. That Thanksgiving insult replayed in my mind, over and over. His smirk, the laughter, my parents' silence. For years, I had swallowed that pain, burying it deep. But now it wasn't just humiliation. It was fuel. Mrs. Patel became my mentor. She guided me through analysis, taught me how to approach investors, how to craft a plan. We met in quiet corners of the bookstore, surrounded by the smell of old paper and ink, plotting not destruction but transformation. I wasn't thinking about revenge in the traditional sense, not at first. I didn't dream of watching my brother beg. I dreamed of justice. Of proving that the sister they had mocked, dismissed, underestimated, was capable of more than they ever imagined. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became. Daniel's company wasn't just unstable, it was vulnerable. Vulnerable to takeover, vulnerable to collapse. And if I played my cards right, I could step in at the perfect moment. It wasn't greed that drove me. It wasn't even pride. It was a need to reclaim my voice, my worth, my dignity. To show him, and everyone else, that I was not the failure they believed me to be. The decision came to me one night as I sat by my window, city lights flickering beyond the glass. I watched the headlights weave through the dark streets and whispered the words out loud, as if saying them would make them real. I'm going to take his company. Not to destroy him, not to humiliate him, but to turn his empire of arrogance into a foundation of justice. For the first time in my life, the thought didn't terrify me. It set me free. Power doesn't arrive with trumpets. It arrives in silence. The weeks after I decided to take Daniel's company blurred into a rhythm of sleepless nights, endless research, and whispered meetings. By day, I lived my usual life, quiet, unimpressive, the unemployed sister everyone pitied or mocked. But by night, I built something no one saw coming. Mrs. Patel became my anchor. We sat in her small office above the bookstore, surrounded by ledgers and spreadsheets, crafting a strategy that felt both impossible and inevitable. This is not about emotion, she reminded me, her voice firm. It's about precision. You can't fight arrogance with anger, you fight it with preparation. And preparation meant funding. I had none. My savings had long since drained into rent and groceries. But Mrs. Patel knew people, quiet investors, old colleagues, business owners who trusted her judgment. She introduced me slowly, carefully, as if presenting me not as who I was, but who I could be. At first, they looked at me with skepticism. Who was I but a woman with no job, no wealth, no status? But I laid out my research, the debt ratios, the faltering contracts, the exodus of employees. I showed them where Daniel was blind, where his arrogance had turned into weakness. And then I showed them my plan. We don't need to destroy the company, I said, voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. We need to save it, but under new leadership. Leadership that listens, that learns, that grows. I can be that leader. The silence after my words was the longest of my life. Then one investor leaned forward, eyes narrowed, and said, If what you've shown is true, the company won't survive under your brother. I'll back you. One by one, others followed. Not all, but enough. Enough to make the impossible possible. Every small victory felt like a secret flame. A silent partner agreeing to back me, a shareholder willing to sell. A contact slipping me information about Daniel's stalled negotiations. Piece by piece, I built the foundation of something that felt like destiny, but it wasn't easy. I barely slept. My nights were filled with numbers, contracts, legal jargon I had to learn on the fly. I lived on black coffee and determination, my eyes red, my hands shaking. Doubt whispered constantly, what if you fail? What if you lose everything? What if this is madness? Sometimes I would stare at the ceiling at 3 a.m., paralyzed by fear. Who was I to think I could take down Daniel? Who was I to think I could run a company? My whole life, I had been told I wasn't enough. What if they were right? But then I would hear his voice again, mocking me at Thanksgiving, sneering across the cafe table, and the fear turned into fire. I wasn't doing this just for me. I was doing this for every moment he had stolen from me, every shred of dignity he had ripped away. The risk was enormous. If the plan collapsed, I would be ruined, not just financially, but publicly. My family would feast on my failure like vultures. Daniel would never let me live it down. But if it worked, one night as I sat hunched over documents in Mrs. Patel's office, she placed a hand on mine. "Remember," she said softly, "power isn't about shouting the loudest. It's about seeing what others refuse to see. You see it. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Those words carried me through. I moved like a shadow, silent but steady. I learned how to approach shareholders discreetly, offering them quiet buyouts. Some laughed at me, dismissing me as a dreamer. Others, weary of Daniel's arrogance, leaned in with interest. Slowly, carefully, shares shifted hands. Contracts were signed. Partnerships were sealed. Daniel had no idea. He strutted through life, boasting at dinners, bragging on social media, utterly convinced of his invincibility. At family gatherings, he still threw casual jabs. "Any luck finding a desk job yet?" He smirked once, loud enough for everyone to hear. I smiled, biting back the truth while he mocked me. I was quietly becoming his boss. The irony tasted sweeter than any victory I could have imagined. Every deal brought me closer, but also deeper into risk. I poured everything I had, my time, my energy, my very sanity, into this plan. There were moments when it felt like I was standing on a cliff, the wind howling, one wrong step away from disaster. And then, at last, the final piece fell into place. It was a cold evening when Mrs. Patel slid a folder across the desk toward me. Inside were the papers, contracts, signatures, proof. My hands trembled as I flipped through them. Page after page confirmed what I had fought for, sacrificed for, bled for in silence. "You're ready," Mrs. Patel said. Her voice was calm, but her eyes shone with pride. I took the pen in my hand. My pulse thundered. Every humiliation, every dismissal, every sneer from Daniel raced through my mind. This wasn't just a signature, it was a reclamation. I pressed the pen to the page and signed. When I set it down, my hands were steady. The ink gleamed under the lamplight, black and undeniable. I was no longer the unemployed sister. I was the hidden majority shareholder of my brother's company. He didn't know it yet. But when he did, the world he had built on arrogance would collapse around him. The boardroom smelled faintly of cologne and coffee, expensive suits brushing shoulders, polished shoes tapping on marble floors. Daniel had called the meeting himself, of course. It was his stage, his kingdom, the place where he thrived on applause. I sat near the back, heart hammering in my chest. To anyone else, I was just a guest, a silent observer. But inside, I carried the weight of a truth no one here yet knew. This was no longer his kingdom. It was mine. Daniel strutted to the front, wearing his favorite navy suit and that smug smile I knew too well. He tapped the microphone, cleared his throat, and launched into his performance. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, spreading his arms wide. "I want to thank you all for coming. As you know, our company is entering its most successful quarter yet. Profits are soaring, our contracts are stronger than ever, and the future is brighter than it's ever been. Under my leadership, we've risen to heights others only dream about." The room erupted in polite applause. My stomach twisted, not from nerves, but from the sheer arrogance dripping from every word. He basked in it, grinning. "And let me tell you, this is only the beginning. I've built this company from the ground up, and no one can stand in our way." That was my cue. I rose slowly, the scrape of my chair cutting through the applause. Heads turned, surprised. Daniel's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but he recovered quickly. "Ah," he said with a chuckle. "My sister's here today. Everyone, this is, well, you know her. Still trying to figure out what she's doing with her life." Laughter scattered around the room. Heat climbed up my neck, but I held steady. This was the moment I had been building toward, the moment every humiliation, every insult had prepared me for. I walked to the front, my heels clicking against the marble, my eyes locked on his. He looked confused now, maybe even a little nervous, but he masked it with mockery. "What are you doing?" he whispered sharply. I turned to the crowd, my voice calm but clear. "What I'm doing," I said, "is reclaiming what was never yours to own alone." The room stilled. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder, the signed papers, the contracts, the proof. My hands no longer trembled. I had spent too many nights imagining this moment to let fear shake me now. "As of last week," I announced, "I am the majority shareholder of this company." Gasps rippled through the room like a wave. Eyes widened, murmurs filled the air. Daniel's face went pale, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. "That's impossible," he stammered. This is a joke." "It's not," I said, steady as stone. I held up the documents for all to see. "The contracts are signed. The shares are mine. This company, Daniel, is no longer under your control." Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Then the whispers began, sharp and fast, spreading through the crowd. Daniel turned to the board members, desperate. "You can't believe this. She's unemployed. She doesn't know anything about business." I looked him dead in the eye. "You've been telling that story for years, but while you were too busy bragging, I was working, learning, planning. And while you dismissed me, I built the very foundation that took your empire out from under you." He stepped closer, his voice a hiss meant only for me. "You think this makes you powerful. You're nothing without me." I leaned in, my reply just as quiet but laced with steel. "No, Daniel, I'm nothing because of you, and that's why I'll never be under your shadow again." The board chair, a gray-haired man with sharp eyes, cleared his throat. "Is this true?" he asked, directing the question to me. I slid the documents across the table. "Every word." He studied them, then nodded slowly. "It appears the ownership has in fact changed hands." The murmurs grew louder. Some smiled at me, impressed. Others shook their heads, stunned. But all of them knew one thing: the balance of power had shifted. Daniel's face twisted, anger flushing his cheeks. "You don't deserve this. You couldn't possibly run this company." I let him rage. Then, when the room was at its tensest, I spoke. "Do you remember last Thanksgiving, Daniel?" My voice carried through the boardroom, clear and deliberate. "When you mocked me in front of our family, called me unemployed, useless." A few people exchanged uneasy glances. Daniel's eyes darted around, realizing too late that his private cruelty was now public knowledge. "Well," I continued, holding his gaze, "this is the answer to that humiliation. You laughed at me for not having a job. Now I have your job, your company, your legacy." The room erupted, not in laughter, but in applause, real applause, the kind I had never heard in my family home. Daniel staggered back, speechless. His mouth opened, but no words came. For the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. I stood taller, breathing in the moment. The years of silence, of being overlooked, of swallowing pain, they all crystallized into this single scene. This was not just revenge. This was justice. I turned back to the board. From this day forward, this company will not be built on arrogance. It will be built on resilience, respect, and responsibility. We will rebuild, not because of Daniel's pride, but in spite of it. More applause, louder this time. And Daniel. He sank into a chair, pale and broken, the weight of his own downfall pressing on him. His kingdom had slipped through his fingers, and I hadn't needed to shout to take it. I had simply waited for the cracks to open and stepped in. As I stood at the head of the table, the reality finally sank in, not just for him, but for me. I had reclaimed my dignity. I had turned humiliation into triumph. My brother, once the untouchable golden child, was left speechless. And for the first time in my life, my family, my world, saw me. The days after the boardroom reveal felt strangely quiet. I had expected chaos, maybe even fireworks, angry calls, endless confrontations. But instead, there was a stillness, the kind that follows a storm. The truth had landed, heavy and undeniable. I was no longer the sister mocked at family dinners. I was the owner. Walking into the office for the first time as majority shareholder, I didn't strut or gloat. I moved with purpose, calm, almost reverent. Employees looked at me with a mix of shock and curiosity. Some whispered, some avoided eye contact, unsure what to make of me. But others, those who had suffered under Daniel's arrogance, smiled faintly, as if they recognized a change was coming. I didn't need to announce my power. Power isn't in the volume of your voice. It's in the steadiness of your presence. And my presence now carried weight. Daniel, on the other hand, unraveled quickly. His pride, once his shield, became his prison. I heard the stories, angry voicemails to board members, bitter rants to anyone who would listen. He stormed into meetings uninvited, tried to rally old allies, but his voice no longer carried authority. He was like a king without a crown, shouting at walls. I never gloated. Not once. Because this was never about watching him burn, it was about rebuilding something better from the ashes. Instead of chasing the spotlight as he had, I focused on listening. I met with employees one by one, asking about their struggles, their ideas, their hopes for the company. I learned more in those quiet conversations than Daniel had in all his years of running the place. Slowly, the fear that had hung in the office began to ease. People started looking at me not as a surprise owner, but as a leader. At home, the shift was just as dramatic. Family dinners turned awkward. Daniel sulked in silence or avoided them altogether. My parents, who had always looked at him with shining eyes, now looked at me differently, not with easy pride, but with a hesitant respect. They didn't know how to reconcile the daughter they had dismissed with the woman who had risen above them all. But here's the truth. I didn't need their respect anymore. For so long, I had craved their validation, starving for it like oxygen. Every insult, every slight, every dismissal had cut deep because I had wanted so badly for them to see me. But now, I had built something greater than their approval. Betrayal had sharpened me. Humiliation had forged me. And in the end, I no longer needed applause from people who had laughed at my scars. One evening, I stood in the office after everyone had gone home. The city lights stretched out beneath the windows, glittering against the night sky. I thought of that Thanksgiving table, the way Daniel had smirked, the way everyone had laughed, the way I had sat in silence with shame burning in my chest. That silence was gone. In its place was something stronger, steadier, not rage, not revenge, just peace. I realized then that closure doesn't come from making others bow to you. It comes from standing tall even if they never do. Daniel may never apologize. My family may never admit how deeply they wounded me, but I didn't need them to. I had already written the ending to this story, and it didn't belong to them. It belonged to me. I placed my hand against the glass, looking out at the city I had once felt too small to conquer. The words rose up in me, not rehearsed, but true, and I spoke them into the quiet. They mocked me for having nothing. They never expected I would own everything. And in that moment, I felt the final knot inside me loosen. I was no longer the girl begging for recognition. I was the woman who had taken her scars and turned them into a crown. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been laughed at for failing, remember this: your scars can become your strength. What would you do if the people who mocked you suddenly had to answer to you? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of revenge, justice, and empowerment.